Most people lose things they can name: a job, a person, a home. They know what is gone, and they know why it hurts. But there is another kind of loss that is harder to explain. No one died. Nothing was taken. Life simply moved forward the way it was supposed to. Children grew up, responsibilities shifted, the years of being constantly needed quietly came to an end. And one morning you woke up to a house that was finally peaceful. No one calling your name. No one waiting for a decision. No schedule built around what other people needed from you. It should have felt like freedom. It did not. Most people who reach this point feel something they cannot quite name, a disorientation that sits underneath ordinary days. They stay busy to avoid it. They fill the silence before it can fill them. They look for new ways to be useful because useful is the only version of themselves they have practiced long enough to trust. I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I am still not sure I have the right words for it, but I will try. The Buddha taught that much of human suffering does not come from what we lose. It comes from what we believed we were before the loss. People spend decades becoming indispensable to their families, their workplaces, the people who depend on them. This is not wrong, but somewhere along the way, being needed stopped being something they did. It became something they were. And when it ended, they did not just lose a role. They lost the only answer they had ever given to the question no one warned them was coming. If you are not the person others need, then who are you? In this talk, we are not going to answer that quickly, because the question deserves more than a quick answer. It deserves to be sat with, looked at directly, and understood the way the Buddha taught us to understand anything that causes suffering. Not by escaping it, by seeing it clearly. 1. You are not the role you have been playing. There is a moment most people cannot point to exactly. It did not happen on a specific day. There was no announcement, no ceremony marking the transition, but somewhere between the years of early mornings and late nights, between the phone calls and the school runs and the work that never fully ended, something shifted quietly inside. The role stopped being what you did. It became what you were. The mother, who has not slept a full night in 3 years, does not think of motherhood as a responsibility she carries. She thinks of it as herself. The manager who answers emails at midnight does not see the job as separate from his identity. The job is how he knows he matters. The caregiver who has spent 5 years organizing another person's life does not experience caregiving as a choice made daily. It is simply who she is, what she is for. This is not a flaw. This is not weakness. The Buddha taught that the mind naturally seeks solid ground. It looks for something stable to stand on, a name, a role, a function, because uncertainty is uncomfortable and identity feels like safety. Clinging to a role is not a moral failure. It is what the mind does when it has never been shown another way. But here is what the Buddha also taught: anything you cling to will eventually move. Not because life is cruel, because nothing in existence holds still. Most people understand impermanence when it applies to things outside themselves. They accept that jobs end, that children grow, that circumstances change. What they do not expect is that the self they built around those things will feel like it is ending too. That is the part no one warns you about. Not the role disappearing, you disappearing with it. You organized your life around being needed. You learned your own value through other people's dependence on you. You measured a good day by whether you had been useful enough, present enough, available enough. And slowly, so slowly, you never noticed it happening. You stopped existing in any other way. You existed in relation, always in relation, never alone, never simply as yourself, never as someone whose presence did not need to justify itself through service. When that structure falls away, the silence it leaves is not empty. It is full of a question you have been too busy to hear. The Buddha described this kind of attachment, upadana, as the mind gripping something so tightly that it forgets the hand exists separately from what it holds. You held the role so long that letting go does not feel like freedom. It feels like losing your hand. This is not a loss of self. This is the first honest meeting with the self that was always underneath. Most people never get there. They replace one role with another before the question can fully form. They find a new busyness, a new person to organize around, a new way to remain useful before they have to sit with what they actually are when no one is watching, no one is waiting, no one needs anything from them at all. But you are here, which means something in you did not run. The Buddha taught that suffering does not come from the role ending. It comes from the belief that you and the role were ever the same thing. They were not. They were never the same thing. You wore the role the way a traveler wears a coat through a long winter, necessarily faithfully, sometimes gratefully. But the coat was never the traveler. Who were you before you became what everyone needed you to be? Not before responsibilities came. Responsibilities are part of a human life. But before you decided somewhere, without deciding that your value existed only inside them, that person did not disappear. They were not erased by years of caregiving or work or devotion to other people. They were simply waiting, quietly, in the only space that was never filled by obligation. The silence you are sitting in now is not proof that you have lost something. It is the first moment in years that space has been available. Not emptiness, space. Those are not the same thing. Emptiness means something is missing. Space means something is possible. The Buddha did not teach people to abandon their roles or to stop loving the people they had served. He taught them to hold every role with open hands, to give fully without gripping, to be present without disappearing into the presence, to love without making love into the only evidence that they existed. You were never just the role. You were the person who chose again and again to show up inside it. That person is still here. That is where we begin. 2. Your usefulness is not your worth. Think about what you were praised for as a child, not who you were. What you did, how helpful you were, how responsible, how you never complained, never asked for too much, never made things harder for the people around you, how you always showed up, how you could be counted on, how you were the one others leaned on when things got difficult. These were not small things to be told. They felt like love. They felt like proof that you belonged, that you mattered, that the space you took up in the world was justified. And so you learned. You learned early and you learned well. You learned that busyness was virtue, that rest was laziness, that asking for something just for yourself was selfish, that your needs were negotiable but other people's needs were not. You learned to measure a good day by how much you had given, how much you had produced, helped, fixed, solved, carried. Most people never unlearn this. They carry it into adulthood, into relationships, into work, into old age. They keep producing, keep helping, keep making themselves useful, not always because they want to, but because somewhere beneath the surface they are still operating on the belief that was planted in them before they were old enough to question it. Your value is what you contribute. Stop contributing and you stop mattering. The Buddha taught that this kind of conditioning, the belief that worth must be earned through action, is one of the deepest forms of upadana, not clinging to a person or a possession, but clinging to a self-concept, a story about what you must do in order to deserve to exist. This is not a character flaw. This is not ingratitude for the people who raised you or the life you built. This is simply what happens when a person spends decades inside a system that rewards output and ignores being. Look honestly at how you have spent your energy, not the big decisions, the daily ones. The way you said yes when you meant no, the way you stayed late when your body was asking you to stop, the way you organized everyone else's life while your own sat waiting, The way you answered the phone took on the extra task, absorbed the extra weight, not because you were asked, but because not doing it felt like a kind of failure you could not name. You were not lazy. You were not weak. You were operating from a belief so deeply embedded it did not feel like a belief. It felt like the truth. The Buddha taught that much of human suffering is not caused by life itself. It is caused by the unexamined assumptions we mistake for reality. The assumption that a person who is not useful is a burden. The assumption that love must be earned through service. The assumption that rest must be justified, that stillness must be productive, that you must always be becoming something, doing something, offering something, or you are simply nothing at all. This is not the truth. This is a very old, very painful, very well-practiced lie. Real value, what Buddhism points to, as the inherent dignity of every conscious being, does not depend on output. It does not increase when you work harder. It does not decrease when you stop. A river does not become less a river because it is not being used for irrigation. It is still moving, still itself, still complete. You existed before you were useful to anyone. There was a version of you, very young, very unformed, who had not yet learned to justify their presence through service. That version was not less worthy of care, less deserving of love, less real. They simply were, without condition, without performance. The person you are now is not different in kind from that child, only in habit. This is not about stopping. This is not about withdrawing from the people you love or refusing to give anymore. Generosity is one of the most beautiful qualities a human being can develop. The Buddha taught dana, the practice of giving, as a path toward freedom, not obligation. But there is a difference between giving from fullness and giving from fear. Giving from fullness says, I have enough. I choose to offer some of it. Giving from fear says, if I stop, I will disappear. Most people who have spent their lives being useful have never known the first kind. They have only ever known the second, and they have called it love, called it duty, called it just who I am, without ever asking whether it was something they chose or something they simply never felt safe enough to put down. You are not what you produce. You never were. That is not a consolation. That is the beginning of something the Buddha called clear seeing. The moment a person stops confusing the performance with the performer, the role with the one who plays it, the doing with the one who does, the doing will return, in new forms at its own pace from a different place inside you. But first, you need to know you exist without it. 3. Silence is not punishment. The house is quiet now. Not the quiet of a Sunday morning when everyone is still asleep and the day has not yet made its demands. A different kind of quiet. The permanent kind. The kind that does not lift when noon arrives or when evening comes or when you wake up the next day and the day after that. The phone sits on the table. It does not ring the way it used to. The calendar has space in it. Real space, not stolen space, not the kind you carved out guiltily between obligations. The decisions that used to arrive in a constant stream, each one needing you, each one pulling at your attention, they have slowed. Some have stopped entirely, and instead of feeling free, you feel erased. Most people do not expect this. They imagined that when the noise finally stopped, they would exhale. They had been waiting for quiet for years, quietly, secretly, in the small hours when exhaustion made honesty easier. They wanted rest. They wanted stillness. They believed that if the demands ever eased, they would finally feel like themselves again. Then the demands eased, and the stillness arrived. And it felt nothing like what they had imagined. It felt like the walls had come down, and there was nothing left behind them. This is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have, and almost no one talks about it honestly. The grief of getting what you thought you wanted. The vertigo of space after years of compression. The way silence, when it finally arrives, does not sound like rest. It sounds like absence. The Buddha taught that the mind which has never learned to be still will experience stillness as threat, not because stillness is dangerous. Because the unexamined mind does not know the difference between peace and emptiness. It has been moving for so long that stopping feels like dying. This is not a weakness. This is what happens to a mind that has been trained year after year to define its own aliveness through activity. Think about water that has been running constantly through a narrow channel for decades. Fast, purposeful, always directed somewhere. Then one day the channel widens, the water spreads out, slows down, and for a moment before it finds its natural level, it looks like the water has lost its way. It looks like stillness. It looks from the outside like nothing is happening. But something is happening. The water is becoming what water actually is when it is not being forced into a shape. You are not disappearing into the quiet, you are spreading into it. The Buddha spent long periods in silence, not because he had withdrawn from life, but because he understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Silence is not the absence of meaning. Silence is where meaning becomes audible. The noise of constant obligation does not create clarity. It postpones it. Every year of busyness, every decade of being needed, every season of putting yourself last, all of it kept something from being heard. The quiet you are sitting in now is not punishment for a life well lived. It is not the universe withdrawing its approval. It is not evidence that you are no longer needed, no longer relevant, no longer real. It is the first conditions in years in which you can actually hear what has been trying to speak beneath everything else. Most people never get this far. They fill the silence before it can teach them anything. They turn on the television before the first real thought can form. They make plans, create obligations, find new urgencies, anything to avoid the particular discomfort of sitting with themselves in a room that asks nothing of them. This is not laziness in reverse. This is not self-indulgence. This is fear wearing the costume of productivity. The Buddha taught sati, mindful presence, not as a technique for relaxation, but as the practice of staying when every conditioned impulse says to move, to sit with what is here, to stop running from the room inside yourself that you have been locking for years. What is in that room is not what you fear. What is in that room is quieter than fear, older than the roles, unchanged by the years of noise. You do not need to fill this silence. You need to learn to sit inside it long enough to realize it was never empty. The discomfort you feel in the quiet is not the quiet telling you something is wrong. It is the quiet asking you for the first time in a very long time to stay. 4. You have given so much, but never asked what you wanted. There is a story from the Zen tradition. A student came to an old teacher and said, "I have spent 30 years serving others. My children are grown. My work is finished. Now I finally have time for myself." He paused. Then, quietly, he added, "But I do not know what that means." The teacher did not answer immediately. He poured tea into the student's cup slowly, carefully, until the cup was full. Then he kept pouring. The tea spilled over the rim, spread across the table, dripped onto the floor. The student watched in confusion. The cup is full. It cannot hold any more. The teacher set down the pot. "You have been pouring for 30 years, he said. "When did you ever stop to ask what your own cup needed?" Most people reach the later chapters of their lives carrying a version of this story inside them, not as a parable, as a lived reality. Decades of giving, of organizing, providing, anticipating, absorbing, and somewhere in the middle of all that, giving, the question of what they themselves wanted became so unfamiliar it stopped forming entirely. Not because they were selfless, not because they were martyrs, because there was never a pause long enough to ask. You told yourself it would come later, after the children were settled, after the mortgage was paid, after the difficult years at work were behind you, after your parents no longer needed care. After things stabilized, and things were always just about to stabilize, always one season away from the moment when you could finally turn your attention toward yourself without guilt. Later became a country you kept meaning to visit, and now you have arrived, and you do not recognize it. The Buddha taught that postponed living is one of the quietest forms of suffering, not dramatic, not visible, not the kind that announces itself. It accumulates the way dust accumulates in a room that is always in use. You do not notice it until the room is finally still, and then you see it everywhere. This is what the Buddhist tradition calls the suffering of not knowing your own citta, your own mind, your own heart, the particular quality of your own inner life. Most people know what they are good at. Most people know what others need from them. Very few people know what genuinely moves them, what they would choose freely, what brings them something that is not just the satisfaction of having been useful. When you ask someone who has spent their life in service what they want, truly want, not what they think they should want, not what seems reasonable at their age, not what would make things easier for everyone else, there is often a long pause. Not because the answer is complicated, because the question has not been practiced. You cannot find an answer you have never been allowed to look for. This is not your failure. The Buddha taught that the conditions we live inside shape the mind more powerfully than intention alone. You lived inside conditions that rewarded giving and made wanting feel dangerous. Wanting felt selfish. Wanting felt like taking something from someone who needed it more. Wanting felt like the kind of luxury available to people who had fewer responsibilities, lighter obligations, smaller lives. So you set it aside, again and again and again. And now the responsibilities have lightened, the obligations have shifted. The life has become in certain ways smaller and quieter than it has ever been. And the wanting, that quiet, patient, long-ignored wanting, does not know how to come forward anymore. It has been in the background so long, it has forgotten how to speak at full volume. This is not permanent. This is not damage. This is what happens to a voice that has not been listened to in a very long time. It does not shout. It waits, tentatively, unsure of its welcome. The Buddha taught that the path back to the self is not dramatic. It does not require grand decisions or complete reinvention. It begins with something much simpler and much harder, the willingness to sit quietly and ask the question that was always there beneath all the years of giving. Not what do I owe? Not what do people need from me? Not what would be responsible or practical or appropriately modest for someone at this stage of life. Just what do I want? You do not have to answer it today. You do not have to answer it this week. But you have to begin asking it, genuinely, without immediately dismissing what comes up as too small, too late, too selfish, or too strange. The cup that has been pouring for 30 years is not empty. It is waiting to find out what it actually wanted to be filled with. 5. The self you are looking for never disappeared. This is where everything shifts. Not because something new is being introduced, because something that was true from the beginning is finally being said directly. In the hook of this talk, a question was planted. If you are not the person others need, then who are you? It has been sitting underneath every teaching since then, unresolved, uncomfortable, doing exactly what an honest question does when it is not rushed toward an easy answer. Here is what Buddhism says. You have been searching for something that was never lost. The self you are grieving, the self you believed disappeared when the roles ended and the silence arrived and the usefulness faded, was never your actual self to begin with. It was a construction, carefully built, faithfully maintained, genuinely useful for a season, but a construction nonetheless. The Buddha taught anatta, non-self, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood teaching in the entire tradition. Most people hear it and feel a kind of vertigo. If there is no self, then what have I been protecting all this time? If there is no fixed identity, then what is left when everything falls away? This is not what anatta teaches. This is the fear speaking, not the teaching. Anatta does not say you do not exist. It says the version of you that you have been clinging to, the one defined by function, by usefulness, by what others needed you to be, was never the whole of you. It was a layer, real while it was needed, but not the foundation, not the thing underneath. Think about it this way. People spend years building a house. They know every room, every corner, every place where the light falls differently in the afternoon. The house becomes so familiar that they begin to confuse it with themselves. When the house changes, when rooms empty, when the structure shifts, when it stops being used the way it once was, they feel they are changing, disappearing, being slowly erased. But they are not the house, they are the one who lived in it. The Buddha taught that every fixed identity, every role, every label, every story about who we are and what we are for is like that house. Useful, sometimes beautiful, worth caring for, but not you. Never entirely you. The awareness that moved through the role, that chose to show up inside it day after day, that felt the weight of it and carried it anyway, that was always something the role could not contain. Most people never discover this, because they never stop long enough for the discovery to happen. They move from role to role, identity to identity, obligation to obligation, always inhabited, always defined, always safely located inside some structure that tells them who they are. The question of what exists beneath the structure never has to be asked, because the structure never fully falls away. Yours has. And that is not a catastrophe. It is an opening. The Zen tradition has a phrase for this moment, the great doubt. Not doubt as despair, doubt as the dissolution of false certainty. The moment when what you thought you knew about yourself loosens enough for something truer to become visible. You are in that moment now. What becomes visible is not nothing. This is the fear, and the fear is wrong. What becomes visible is what was always there before the roles began, before you learned to be useful, before someone needed you to be something specific and you shaped yourself to fit. Before the long years of becoming, there was simply being, quiet, unchosen, underneath everything. That has not changed. It cannot change. The Buddha taught that awareness itself, the quality of simply being present, of experiencing, of knowing that experience is happening, does not belong to any role. It does not retire. It does not become redundant. It does not need to justify itself through service or productivity or being needed. It simply is. You simply are. Not the mother, not the manager, not the caregiver, not the person who held everything together. Not the role that ended and took your sense of self with it when it went. Underneath all of that, before all of that, something was present, something that noticed, something that felt, something that has been here the entire time, quietly persistent, waiting for exactly this, a moment when the noise was finally quiet enough for you to hear it. You are not looking for yourself. You are remembering yourself. There is a difference. Looking implies something was lost and must be found somewhere else, in a new purpose, a new role, a new reason to be useful. Remembering implies it was always here. It only needed the right conditions to become audible again. The silence you have been afraid of is those conditions. You were never gone. You were always the one who was here. 6. Learning to stay with yourself. Most people know how to be alone. They have spent plenty of time in empty rooms, in quiet evenings, in the spaces between one obligation and the next. Being alone is not unusual. Most people have done it thousands of times. What most people have never learned is how to stay. There is a difference. Being alone is a circumstance. Staying is a practice. Being alone means the room is empty of other people. Staying means you are fully present in that room. not planning the next thing, not reviewing the last thing, not filling the silence with noise so thin it barely registers as distraction but functions as one nonetheless. Staying means you are here, actually here, without an agenda that requires you to be somewhere else inside your own mind. Most people cannot do this. Not because they are weak or undisciplined, because nobody taught them how. Nobody told them it was something that needed to be learned, practiced, returned to, again and again the way any real skill is returned to. Nobody said the ability to sit with yourself without immediately reaching for escape. This is one of the most important things a human being can develop. This matters. Practice it. Instead, most people were taught the opposite. Stay busy, stay useful, stay connected, stay occupied. The mind that is always moving is the mind that is productive. The mind that stops is the mind that is wasting time. The Buddha taught something that cuts directly against this. He taught that the unexamined mind, the mind that has never been asked to sit still and simply observe itself, is a mind that suffers unnecessarily. Not because stillness is magical, because the mind that cannot be with itself has no foundation. It depends entirely on external conditions to feel stable. Remove the conditions and the stability collapses. You have felt this collapse. That is why you are here. Learning to stay with yourself does not mean sitting in formal meditation for hours. It does not mean achieving some particular state of inner quiet that feels nothing like ordinary life. This is not about technique. It is about permission. Permission to sit in the garden without immediately thinking about what needs to be done in it. Permission to drink your morning tea and let the cup be the only thing that matters for 5 minutes. Permission to walk slowly, not for exercise, not toward anything, just slowly, just here, just noticing what the air feels like and what your feet know about the ground beneath them. Permission to read something you genuinely want to read, not because it will make you more informed or more useful or more prepared for anything, but because something in you wants to follow a sentence to its end. These are not small things. These are the first acts of a person who is learning that their inner life has value independent of its productivity. The Buddha taught sati, mindful presence, as the foundation of all practice. Not because presence leads to enlightenment in some distant future, but because a person who cannot be present with themselves cannot be genuinely present with anyone else. All the years of giving, of showing up for others, of being reliably there, they were built on something. They were built on you. And if you never learned to be there for yourself, what was being offered to others was always running on reserve. The tank was emptying. You just did not stop long enough to notice. Staying with yourself replenishes something that decades of outward focus depleted. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way moisture returns to dry soil after rain slowly from the inside in the places that were cracked and waiting without knowing they were waiting. What you will find when you begin to stay is not the emptiness you feared. You will find something quieter than that. You will find a quality of attention that has always been yours, but was always turned outward. You will find preferences you forgot you had. Small ones first. The particular slant of afternoon light that has always made you feel something without knowing what. The kind of music that belongs to no one else but you. The pace at which your own thoughts move when they are not being organized around someone else's needs. You will find slowly that the company you have been most afraid of your own is also the company that has known you longest, has never left, has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to finally stop long enough to notice it was there. 7. The next chapter does not have to look like the last one. For a long time, giving was the shape of your life. Not giving in the abstract, giving in the specific, daily, unglamorous way that most real giving actually happens. Waking up before you were ready because someone needed you to. staying longer than you intended because leaving felt irresponsible, saying yes when your body was already running on the quiet desperation of someone who has forgotten what no feels like, absorbing difficulty so that the people around you would not have to carry it alone. This was not nothing. Do not let anyone, including the part of yourself that is exhausted and questioning everything, convince you that it was nothing. Years of faithful presence, years of showing up, years of being the person others could count on when counting on someone mattered most. That was real. It happened. It shaped people. It shaped you. But it was one chapter, and chapters end. Not because they failed, because that is what chapters do. The question most people ask at this point is the wrong question. They ask, how do I find a new way to be useful? How do I replace what I was doing with something equivalent? How do I locate another role, another purpose, another structure that will give my days the same shape they had before? This is not wrong to ask, but it is asking from the wrong place. The Buddha taught that there are two very different sources from which a person can give. The tradition calls one giving from depletion, dana practiced as obligation, as fear, as the only way the mind knows how to justify its own existence, and the other giving from sufficiency, dana practiced as genuine choice from a place that has first been replenished, first been understood, first been allowed to simply be before it was asked to do. Most people who have spent their lives in service have only ever known the first kind. They gave because they were needed. They gave because stopping felt selfish. They gave because somewhere beneath the giving was a quiet, unexamined terror that if they ever stopped, the love would stop too. That being needed and being loved were the same thing, and removing one would remove the other. This is not love. This is not generosity. This is the mind protecting itself the only way it was ever taught to. Real generosity, the kind the Buddha described as one of the most liberating qualities a human being can cultivate, does not come from fear. It does not come from the need to remain relevant. It does not come from the exhausted place that gives because it does not know how to stop. It comes from fullness, from a person who has sat with themselves long enough to know what they actually have to offer, not what they feel obligated to offer, not what is expected of them, not what will keep them necessary in someone else's life. What they genuinely, freely, from the deepest part of themselves, want to give. That kind of giving does not deplete. It circulates. It comes back. The next chapter of your life does not need to be a quieter, slower version of the last one. It does not need to be organized around the same values, the same measures of a good day, the same definition of what it means to matter. It can be organized around something you have not been allowed to organize around before. What you actually are, what you actually want, what moves through you when nothing is required of you, and you are free, truly free to notice what remains. Some people discover in this freedom that they still want to give in similar ways. They return to service, to care, to contribution, but differently, lighter, more chosen, from a place that knows the difference between I want to and I have to, and chooses the first one deliberately. Some people discover things they had completely forgotten, a way of spending an afternoon that belongs only to them, a kind of attention they had been saving for later without knowing it, a quality of joy so simple it seems almost embarrassing, and is for exactly that reason entirely theirs. Both are right. Neither is better. What matters is not what the next chapter looks like. What matters is that for the first time, you are the one writing it. Not performing a role someone else cast you in. Not maintaining a version of yourself built around what others needed you to be. Not giving from depletion because fullness was never permitted. Writing it from the inside. In your own words. At your own pace. The Buddha taught that the path is not found by moving faster. It is found by finally moving in the right direction. You have been moving in the right direction longer than you know. The next step is simply yours to take. Do you remember the morning this began? The quiet house, the phone that did not ring, the space where all the needing used to be. The feeling unexpected, disorienting that, without anyone requiring something from you, you had somehow become less real. That morning has not changed. The quiet is still there. The space is still there. But something is different now, not in the circumstances, in the one who is sitting inside them. You came into this talk carrying a question that felt like a wound. If no one needs me anymore, then who am I? You were looking for an answer that would fill the space. A new role, a new purpose, a new way to justify the room you take up in the world. What Buddhism offered instead was something quieter than an answer. A reminder. You were never the role. You were never the usefulness. You were never the version of yourself that existed only in relation to what others needed you to become. Beneath all of that, before all of that, something has always been here. Aware. Present. Unchanged by the years of noise. That is what remains. That is what was always real. The silence you once feared is not empty. It never was. It is the first place in years where you can hear yourself clearly, not the performing self, not the giving self, not the self that earned its place through service. Just you. The cup is not empty. It is finally free to be filled with something that is actually yours. In the comments write, one thing you used to do not for anyone else, not because it was useful, not because it made you easier to love, just because it was yours. Because something in you wanted it. That is where the next chapter begins.